Okay. Oh, sorry. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay, great. Welcome. My name is Paloma López, and I am the education manager for the Indian Arts Research Center here at the School for Advanced Research. Thank you all for coming, and thank you to those of you watching at home for joining us this evening. I would like to begin by acknowledging that SAR is situated on traditional Tewa lands, Ogopogo Winge, or White Shell Water Place, and that our campus is surrounded by the landscapes of Pueblo, Apache, and Diné communities. As an institution privileged to steward Indigenous cultural material and committed to uplifting Indigenous voices, we strive to maintain respectful and mutually beneficial relationships with these communities. We are gathered here this evening to celebrate our 2023 Ron and Susan Dubin Native Artist Fellow, Heidi Brandow. It's been a real honor to get to know Heidi a little over the past couple of months and to peek inside of her process. We will definitely miss her when she leaves campus this summer. For those of you who don't know, Heidi Brandow is a Diné Kanaka Maoli multidisciplinary artist who prioritizes Indigenous perspectives in the creation of ethical and sustainable forms of artistic expression. Heidi takes influence from architecture and design with a focus on collaboration, material, and the built environment, often combining unexpected materials to create her art. Most recently, Heidi has been drawn to micaceous pottery. Over the past year, she has spent time working with Pueblo elders at the Poe Cultural Center, learning the fundamentals of pottery making to better incorporate the practice into her own three-dimensional work. Heidi's work can be found in the permanent collections of museums here in New Mexico and across the United States, as well as abroad. Apart from being an artist, Heidi is also the Associate Director of Communications for the First Peoples Fund, an MFA Master Artist Mentor at IARC, and guest curator and consultant for the Coe Center for the Arts. She is represented by Form and Concept Gallery here in Santa Fe and will be showing at Indian Market next week, so you should swing by her booth. Before I turn things over to Heidi, I just wanted to remind everybody who is here in person that after the talk there will be an open studio and light refreshments at the Dubin Studio, so please stick around for that, for a chance to see some of Heidi's work in person. And lastly, I want to thank the Dubin family for their continued support of this fellowship. So without further ado, I will turn things over to Heidi Brandow.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? Yat e she Heidi Brandow Yanisha Hawaiian Nishlinto Torich Eatni Bashichin Hawaiian A Dashichedo Nashkali Dashinale. Hello everyone. Thank you all for being here today. And thank you Paloma for a really warm introduction, and also for everyone's support here during my time as a fellow. Totally much appreciated. And also, of course, to the Dubin family, thank you for your support. And my ability to participate in this program has been truly remarkable experience. So thank you. So how do I begin? So as Paloma had mentioned, I'm a multidisciplinary artist, primarily working as a painter, based here in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I always start all of my presentations just talking about the fact that, of course, I'm also a mother. I have two boys who just recently graduated high school. And they play a really important and pivotal role in who I am as a person, and of course in the work that I do as an artist and everything else related to that. So I thought that I'd begin the presentation just kind of briefly talking about my practice and giving some examples of the work that I do. A lot of the work that I've done, especially, I guess like a consistent theme that you can say pops up from time to time within my work, is this theme related to these monsters, quote unquote. These little guys I like to use as sort of a device to explore different materials and layering of information and patterns. And the monsters, of course, are generally like these playful characters that I've come up with. None of them, I get this question all the time, is who are they? What are their names? I don't have any names for them. They're kind of anonymous, and I kind of like it that way. The inspiration for these characters, I would say, is most likely derived from having grown up in Hawaii. My mom is Native Hawaiian, and we grew up on the Big Island. And for those of you that are familiar or not familiar, Hawaii has a very strong Asian or Japanese influence. And so we were constantly just surrounded by Japanese culture and everything, like candies. My mom even at one time had sent me when I was in 7th grade to Japanese language school. I don't remember much of it, but I do think like being surrounded in that environment definitely left an impression and continues to inform these little characters that I continue to come back to. And then again, like I had mentioned earlier, really, I think the work that I continue to pursue is just kind of playing with materials, and also just kind of layering of information, textures, colors, and a little bit like moving this type of experimentation into larger scales, if you will. I had a period after I had studied industrial design at Istanbul Technical University in Istanbul, Turkey, where I had really just wanted to sort of pare down sort of the color palette and the images that I was working with. And so a series of work that came out of that period, you know, looked like this. And a lot of this actually was inspired by, what is it called? Sort of like these, I can't remember the name off the top of my head at the moment, but a lot of these sort of like technical drawings that were given, for patents. I would look at a lot of different patents, like I spent so much time just kind of like picking through patents and using a lot of those ideas as inspiration for the work that I was pursuing at that point in my career. And then sort of a more recent icon or iconography that I've been using are these are not human skulls. I guess that they would be maybe the skulls or the remains of the monsters that I've been using. And all of this came about as a result of my time working or having another residency actually at UCross in Wyoming. If any of you are familiar with that area, it's very close to the border of Montana, really beautiful, but you're really like in nature. And it's gorgeous, but like it was so common to see the remains of other animals while you're out walking, and if you took those walks regularly, you would see that sort of decay happening every day. And I really became sort of fascinated with that. But I think also at that point in my life, I was preparing to go to graduate school, and my family and I had made the decision that me moving to Boston would involve me having my kids stay here in Santa Fe, stay at our home, continue to go to school with their friends, and so to continue to be in this community. So I think in my heart, I was really grieving, I was sad. Sorry, I don't want to get sad because it happened already. But yeah, I think I was just kind of going through the motions, I was also leaving home and pursuing. I went to school at the Harvard Graduate School of Design, and I was really excited, but it was funny because I remember, I think it was like a day or two before I left, I stopped by my gallery to drop off some work, and Sandy Zane, who owns Zane Bennett and Foreman Concept, came downstairs, and they were so excited. They were like, "Oh, this is so great that you're going to school," and blah, blah, blah. And I started crying, and I was like, "I don't want to go." Of course, she was like, "Are you crazy? You can't not go, So anyways, like fast forward, of course, I did go. Everything was fine. But this came out of that period. And it's still sort of an image or motif that I continue to work with. And I think in the same sense as working with the monsters, I think there was also a part of me that just kind of wanted to take a little break, because I was really going full on with that motif for a while. And this series of work really allowed me to sort of take a step back and kind of continue to experiment with layering of information and patterns, colors and materials, but with a different motif. Right around the same time, I became really interested in social engagement work. This all came about as part of another residency that I had done while I was working in Turkey. It was right at the start of the Syrian civil war, and so many refugees were just spilling into the country, and we were seeing it like in real time, and I had never experienced anything like that in my life. And every time I would speak with friends or family back home, nobody knew what I was talking about. Nobody heard about any of this. Like, the news wasn't talking about it. And so, you know, there was a lot of things, I think, kind of going through my mind at the moment. And of course, when I was on that residency, that wasn't something that I was a part of my project plan, if you will. But it was something that really impacted me in the sense that I wanted to pursue work that, on one hand, shed light on these issues that were, you know, incredibly impactful from a global scale, but also initiated some type of dialogue, because even though I was a foreigner in that context, I definitely, it made me think or draw parallels between our own displacement as Native people in our own homeland and what that could have looked like for my ancestors as we were forced to move and leave and you know, be separated from our own territorial homeland. So as a result, I ended up going back the following year and working with these artists in Istanbul. And we developed a project called the Defining Home Project. And basically, we worked with Syrian nationals and Turkish nationals on just documenting what their definitions of home were at the time, and then creating an exhibition based on that project. Then it ended up getting funded here in the US through NMAI. So I was able to then basically fold the same conversation or touch point among local community members. Brian Vio, former director here also at IARC, was a really great supporter and was one of the participants. But it was kind of nice to be able to then, like, you know, use something that had started abroad and bring it home locally to get that additional experience. Another project that I had worked on was I became really interested in trash collectors and the trash collectors in Turkey. Trash and recycling is still collected by humans, by hand, and it's not necessarily really automated. Here, of course, in Santa Fe, we push our carts out, whatever. My day is on Thursday. Push it out on Thursday, they come and they pick it up. And there, it's like these people come with these huge bags and fill up their bags, and then they just walk with these little, like, it's literally like a dolly that's attached somehow, and they have these huge bags and they're climbing all over the city, which of course, as you probably know, Istanbul is like a mega city, and so they're, you know, having to deal with traffic and just like the massive population, and of course all these crazy hills. And I wanted to know what their deal was. So I went there and I worked with the Afghan embassy, and I had a Turkish assistant at the time. And we, in a similar way, just documented what the stories were there and what their life was about. And, you know, there were so many things that came out of that project that I hadn't anticipated. You know, of course, I'm going in it thinking like, oh, I'm gonna like figure out what's their deal. And then I'm finding out, oh, this is like, you know, human rights violations, like just every kind of really insane situation that you could think of became apparent as I continued to work with these communities. And then I was able to pursue an additional social engagement project here in Santa Fe through the Santa Fe Art Institute. This was in 2018, right before this larger conversation that we're familiar with on monuments became a big topic of discussion. And in a similar light, I was working with the Parks and City of Santa Fe Parks and Recreation, and wanted to find out like what monuments represented Native people within the city of Santa Fe. And so, you know, I ended up building all of these different maps that kind of pointed out the disparities in representation that exist within the monuments within the city. And I think, you know, there's like 50-something monuments, and of the 50, there's 4 that are officially dedicated to Native people, with one of them also being the Soldiers' Monument at the time, which is the obelisk that's been torn down in the middle of Santa Fe. But that was, at the time, categorized as a monument that was dedicated to Native people. But we know now, of course, right, today, that it's highly problematic, and perhaps those, and it's still covered. It's like, I've thought about actually doing another project where just documenting those squares that they build on the problematic monuments, because they look funny, you know? It's like, I think there's one over by the post office, and there are probably several other ones, but it's just kind of this ongoing dialogue of how nobody really wants to talk about it. So anyway, it was a really great project, and it folded into these other larger community conversations where I asked you know, people in the community if they had the opportunity to create a monument, what would it be and where would it be located? And so documenting those discussions, and then also mapping out where those different monuments would exist in Santa Fe. You know, thinking about like indigenous futurism, there was an exhibition a few years ago in 2020, I think, or 2019, at the Museum of Contemporary Native Art downtown on indigenous futurism. And I was home for break during my first year of grad school, and it was just like, for me, a problematic exhibition in the sense that the majority of the pieces that were in the exhibition were primarily pieces about Star Wars and Star Trek in a Native context, which, by the way, like, I love a really cute beaded Baby Yoda, like anybody else. I have no problem with those items. But I do feel like in the larger sort of landscape of this conversation of futurism, Native communities, Native people have sort of been beholden to that specific framework of the conversation. Whereas other communities are allowed to think wildly and you know, positively or otherwise about how they imagine themselves existing in the future. And So as a response, I decided, well, what does that mean to me? How would that translate? Like, what does Indigenous futurism mean to me? And to me, it really meant that how can we use our knowledge as Native people, our cultural knowledge, in addressing the issues that we have today for potential answers that we have in the future, or that we need in the future. And I think actually that this is where I realized that, I was like, artists generally are interested in asking questions, but I think because I've also studied design, that I'm also urged to pursue an answer to the question. And so a friend of mine actually, I had Thanksgiving with them in Salem, Massachusetts when I was on break, and she's Navajo. Actually, she used to work, she was a fellow here as well. But she was telling me about her nephew who was like 10 years old or something, and how he had this really severe form of like terminal cancer. And it's all as a result of exposure to these open mines, uranium mines that exist on the Navajo Nation, of which there are nearly 500 open mines. And so every day for the last 50 years or so, our community has been constantly getting exposed to these toxic materials, resulting in situations like, my friend's family having to experience, her nephew having to experience terminal cancer, which eventually did end up taking his life a few years ago. So I thought of like, well, what would we do to like address that? And I thought, well, if we have this knowledge related to how we understand textiles and dye materials, perhaps we can also consider the phytoremediative properties of these plants that could also be used to dye textiles. And so I ended up creating this whole, this is just a small segment of that, but this whole sort of newly imagined dye chart, if you will, which actually could be, a solution for our long-term viability of living on these lands. Spent a lot of time sort of looking at the problematic issues related to museum and institutional archiving systems as it relates to our Indigenous material culture and our sort of ongoing lack of relationship or engagement with these items. And so did a lot of work there and still continue to work on projects. Thankfully, I was working with local contexts at one point right out of grad school, and then I still continue to help the Center for Art on addressing their collection and working with Indigenous community members and sort of augmenting provenance associated with their archives. So all of this comes back to then, I think working with a bunch of architects during grad school really impacted me in the sense that I became very interested in combining three-dimensional elements into my painting. And honestly, that was like something that I never was interested in. I just started doing it during the pandemic and I really liked it. And so I kept doing it. And I've continued to sort of play with these materials. And in fact, my proposal to work here at SAR included sort of this desire to continue exploring three-dimensional elements with my paintings. So as Paloma had mentioned, over the last year, I've been working or taking classes at the Poe Cultural Center in Poake, Pueblo, and specifically working with micaceous pottery. And similar to how I was never necessarily really drawn to three-dimensional forms prior to making or experimenting with it, it's kind of the same with pottery. It was never something that I felt like, oh, this is my calling and I need to do this. But I mean, it was definitely something that I really admired and of all of the different pottery forms that are found locally, I think micaceous was definitely the one that drew my interest the most. Mostly because, as I started sort of researching, of course, I love like sort of the subdued, but also just very beautiful glimmering nature of micaceous pottery. Also recognizing that it has existed in native and non-native communities here in northern New Mexico for forever. But it is also, according to All That Glitters, I can't remember the author's name of that book, one of the few, if the only, form of pottery made here in northern New Mexico, or in New Mexico and in this region, that was the least impacted by commercial trade or by traders or by non-native influence. Because historically, as I'm sure many of you know, a lot of the other forms of pottery, just as one example, were often the motifs that were then added, or the colors were definitely at some point or another influenced by trade and by non-native influence. So there's something really about that sort of continued presence in community. Also the utilitarian value of these items that is really sort of striking and also beautiful and subdued. And so that's what really drew me to that process. But I thought I'd also take this as an opportunity to talk a little bit about kind of my own sort of relationship in a very abstract way, or very distant way, if you will, to pottery. And thanks to having the ability to be in this residency, I was able to spend a lot more time researching these things. And so pottery actually did also exist in Polynesia. And I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. So Austronesians, which is essentially relating to or denoting a family of languages spoken in an area extending from Madagascar in the west to the Pacific Islands in the east, possessed advanced stratified societies and maritime expertise, settling Melanesia's coast and expanding to Polynesia and Micronesia. Proficient navigators and ceramicists, they left distinctive lapita pottery wherever clay was available, from the Bismarck Archipelago to Samoa. Identifying this pottery and its legacy among subsequent cultures, such as Micronesians and Polynesians, relies on features like red slip technique, specific decorations, and unique pot forms. Around 3,500 years ago, Austronesians established their first settlements on previously uninhabited Micronesian islands. This image here is an example of some of the pottery remnants that have been found in that region. When we're talking about Polynesia and also like what's called the Bismarck Archipelago, so this little top corner here, of course, is Austronesia, and then I would say from like Fiji, Tonga, Samoa, and up they would also be included in what's called the Polynesian Triangle. But essentially this map shows us clearly where they have had a significant amount of archaeological evidence pointing to the Lapita communities, Lapita being sort of the predecessors of what would then become Polynesian people, Polynesian communities of Lapita pottery. And so you will find it in this region as you go more east from Samoa into Polynesia, so that would be Tahiti, Hawaii, New Zealand. The pottery scene just diminished, and that's also because of a lack of access to those type of materials and sort of switching to gourds as utilitarian pieces, carving utilitarian ware out of stone and also wood. Additionally, I just wanted to share a couple other examples of some of these fragments that have been found. The Mariana Islands are a little bit north of, sort of closer to Papua New Guinea, but these are some of the examples of what some of those pieces would have looked like. And then this one is quite lovely, actually. This one is more closer to Papua New Guinea, and sort of these like faces and these type of patterns and designs were more prominent in what is now Papua New Guinea. This map here shows the Polynesian Triangle. There was some evidence of clay and sort of pottery making in New Zealand to some degree. However, it was never necessarily like a prominent practice among the Maori people. Although it was interesting to find out that while Maori people, for example, did not necessarily make pottery ware regularly, they had over 30 different terms in te reo, which is their language, te reo Maori, to describe or to talk about clay. So it was something that they were aware of, not something necessarily that they were making pottery with, but definitely there was a presence and understanding of this material among Maori people. Another example, these pieces in particular were found in Tonga. I'm showing these items because Tonga is definitely a part of Polynesia, but it's also something that I also was not necessarily familiar with and aware of as a practice. And again, to the left, the one with the pattern on the background, a piece from Tonga, and the item on the right is an item or a pottery ware from Fiji. These practices are not necessarily super prolific in the region, but just something that I thought was really interesting as it relates to sort of my kind of ongoing interest and engagement with clay here, and sort of understanding kind of its historical context for myself personally. And then I just wanted to share just some images of some of the firings that we've done over the last year. This was done at the Po Cultural Center in Poake Pueblo. I had the good fortune of working with Michael Bancroft, who is a gentleman in the blue up there, the blue denim. Really just amazing instructor, and honestly, like everybody in that setting, in that class, in that community is incredibly proficient and amazing, and they're all masters, quite honestly. But they're just so humble and kind and generous with their time and knowledge. And I think that that was one of the sort of good fortunes, if you will, of going into pursuing this study in that particular setting, was walking into a community of people who were just so warm and open and just incredible. Like, I can't even begin to talk about how grateful I am to have had this experience of working with all of these potters over the last year. And again, just some examples of one of our firings. Both of these images are actually after we've already pulled everything out. I guess with that said, honestly, that's my last slide. And I'll talk a little bit about my experience really briefly before we depart to go to the studio space, which is that I have spent the time here primarily working on paintings, because that is sort of the foundation of my practice. And I had started out as wanting to consider building out a clay figure, One of the things I realized, though, is that as an early young student in the medium, it's a quite ambitious goal, actually, for me to try to do that. However, I do think that the quality of sort of the bowls that I had worked on have gotten better. They've gotten thinner. They've gotten lighter. They haven't gotten as big as, say, like Lonnie V. Hill. I probably will never be like that. But I do think there's a couple caveats or things that I took away from my experience of working in this community. The first of which was like at our last firing, I remember speaking, we were all waiting for our pottery to warm up before we put them into the fire. And one of the elders was like, hey, so how do you feel about your pieces? How do you feel about your time? And what are you thinking? And I was like, I don't know, like, I don't feel like it was really like perfect. And, you know, like, you can feel it, you know, you can feel if it's even. And I was like, I don't know, I don't really feel like it was even. And he just cut me off right there, right before I could keep going and like being self-deprecating. And he was like, no, this is why I love this medium, actually, because it'll never be perfect. You will always find an imperfection somewhere. And that's the beauty of it. I could cry, actually. And I really needed to hear that, you know, because I think in this practice, you need to be aware of that always. But I think as a life lesson, you know, to be aware of that those imperfections are always going to be there, they're always going to be present, and that's actually the beauty of our practice, and to sort of take a deep breath and kind of like take it all in, you know. The other thing that I learned, which I've definitely applied here, is another auntie elder asked me a similar question at the same firing, and I told her, I said, you know, one of the things I noticed about the stuff I was working on now is that I had a hard time getting them really big, and I really felt like they were really clunky and chubby, and I couldn't figure out what was going on. I was like, they just kept staying small, and she was like, every time you feel like that, you gotta add another coil. She's like, you gotta add another coil. And we were just cracking up. She was like, no, really, like, you just gotta get in there. You gotta keep going. You gotta keep putting more. And when you get over that one and you get it nice, she's like, put another one. And I was like, honestly, we gotta do that all the time. Like, you know, and I feel like I was standing in my own way so many times, and in the process of sort of kind of, you know, working with the material, of feeling like, oh, I might mess this up, or maybe this is enough. And it's like, no, I kept hearing her voice, like, put another coil, like, keep going, you know. And I have to do that, honestly. Like, I have to do that for everything. And so thankfully, I'm able to learn these really valuable lessons through this process of working with clay and with these community members, because it's definitely like seeping into other aspects of my creative practice. So with that said, I think. Are you up for a couple audience questions? Yeah, sure. Sure.
All right, so we will open the floor for audience questions. So those that watching can hear you.
I hope this isn't too loud.
Sure.
It's so nice of you to share your experiences with us. I really appreciate that. I noticed when you were first showing your paintings that you very much like to have panels, both horizontal or vertical. Mm-hmm. Is that a formalistic thing for you, or does it have a deeper meaning?
I don't know. I think about that too, because I am 100% drawn to that sort of rectangular, narrow field of, or scale of working. And it's a conversation that I've had actually with another former fellow, Eliza Naranjo Morse. We've talked about this. And I don't know. I wish I had a really cool, like, clever answer to give you, but maybe it has something to do with my way of understanding sort of stories and storytelling. I think I like things to be sort of condensed. I think also maybe, yeah, like as I'm saying that, I'm like, yeah, I guess I am really kind of that person that's like straight to the point. I can really appreciate when, you know, information is like concise, and so maybe that's the deal. I'm not sure, but I kind of like this idea that that could be probably one of the reasons. So.
Are there any other questions?
You've done so much. I'm wondering, when did you know being an artist was your path or your direction?
I think I knew when, you know, when I first went to college. I went to college as a computer engineer, and I easily probably could have like just done that because my parents actually were really like prepping us for that life, you know. Every summer they would send us away and we'd go do a science thing, and but then I left and I ended up moving back to Santa Fe, and I think it became clear that, and art, by the way, was always something that was sort of in the background. But I think my parents were very like practical and thinking, oh, I don't know, like can't really have like a life out of that, you know. They never said it like that, but I'm sure they were thinking it. And when I moved back to Santa Fe, though, I, you know, met my son's father, and we just started making work all the time, every day, pretty much. And I remember I had my first show, and everything sold out like within the first like week or two, and it was really encouraging. So then I thought, okay, well, maybe I'll just keep going, and I kept going, and. And here we are. So, but I do think that, like, because of having that sort of sciencey background and like that design background, that I will probably continue to always be like really super curious about things, maybe more than, and I think that's reflective in kind of the broad mediums that I'm using in my work. So. Sure.
I'm just curious about the materials that you use, because you describe yourself fundamentally as a painter, but you don't just do like oil on canvas. If you could talk a little bit about the materials.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So the paintings actually are a whole process, and they're all built on wood surfaces, wood frames, and then it's several layers actually of plaster. And then they're all like sanded down until it's like a workable, like fine paper surface. And then once it's there, then I'm able to paint or draw or apply, you know, whatever medium I'm working with. And then after that, usually it's sealed up with like an acrylic resin to just kind of seal all of those materials together. But yeah, it's a pretty like, I hardly ever work on canvas, actually, yeah.
Any other questions? No? Okay, I think we can head on over to the Dubin Studio and take a look at some of your work.
Great, thanks everyone. I don't have to turn it off or anything.
No, you're good.
Okay.
I can take your mic for you, though, if you'd like.
Oh, yeah, right.
That was awesome. That was really good.
Yeah, okay.